Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Trends in Account Takeover Fraud, the Era of the Industrialized ATO Attack, presented by Aite Group Senior Analyst, Trace Fouché. I'm Siobhan Scanlon, and I'll be one of your Aite Group hosts for today's webinar. We'll be starting the webinar shortly, but first, let me take care of a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded, and a link to view the webinar on demand will be available to all current Aite Group clients of our fraud and AML practice. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit your questions using the questions feature located in the GoToWebinar toolbar to the right of your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Trace Fouché is a senior analyst with Aite Group's fraud and AML team, where he covers fraud and data security issues. Prior to joining Aite Group, he was the head of fraud strategy for SunTrust Bank, where he was responsible for developing, managing, and articulating strategic investments and transformation initiatives that sought to improve the balance between loss prevention, client experience, and operational expense. So without further ado, I'll now turn the mic over to Trace. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy today's webinar.
Thanks, Siobhan. And good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining our discussion of trends in account takeover fraud. There's some very interesting patterns emerging in how the fraudsters are shifting their tactics. Our discussion today will start with a little bit of background on how tactics have evolved historically before we move on to discuss the drivers of recent shifts in tactics. Finally, we'll round it out with some considerations for how to adjust mitigation strategy before we open it up for some questions. Part of my background is in analytics, and if there's one thing I learned as an analytics practitioner, it was that context matters. So I'm going to start by establishing a little bit of context by way of a very brief grounding in the history of account takeover before moving on to a conceptual model for the fraudster's value chain. Account takeover, or ATO fraud, has been a growing concern among many fraud leaders across the industry for the past few years, and for good reason. It is a peculiar and particularly unsettling form of attack, and one that has evaded a standardized definition for years. It is, therefore, safe to say that it is one of the most poorly measured kinds of fraud. If it's poorly measured, then it stands to reason that it's also poorly understood. As a fraud practitioner, I always ascribed a kind of mythical quality to it. It was a boogeyman that inspired a kind of irrational fear. I think that was mainly because the more I got familiar with it, the more it became increasingly clear to me just how difficult it was going to be to accurately detect it and prevent it.